Let me say that I have to admit, this is a daunting task, pulling together the very rich conversation that has occurred over the last few days with really a very lively, informed, vibrant discussion. I feel very, very positive about the conversation and the energy and the commitment that I saw present in the room. I have to confess that I feel it will be a considerable challenge, one, intellectually to pull this together, and two, if you're anything like me, my brain is about 3/4 fried at the moment, and how I'm going to sort of synthesize this on the fly is, as I stand here, quite beyond me. But nonetheless, I will try, since I've been asked to do it. And let me start by taking us back to the beginning of our conversation yesterday and remind ourselves that the framing concept for our Innovation Summit was the idea of ecosystem. Systems thinking obviously is useful in this context because it points us in the direction to the notion that everything is linked. And I think that's really a very, very important component of this conversation around innovation. The chain of actions and results is only as strong as the weakest link. We had a number of speakers emphasize that if there's a component of the system that's missing or that fails significantly, then we face a very, very difficult situation. I think it's one of these, to switch metaphors, it's one of these things where you start pulling on a thread and before you know it, the whole sweater's unraveled. And I think there's an element of that here. So as we go forward with this conversation towards some new ideas, new policies, new actions, I think it's really important to remind ourselves to pay attention to all of the linkages and not get swept up in any kinds of magical thinking about silver bullets that can solve everything. Certainly in the economic development game, there are no silver bullets. We know this at our own deep cost in Nova Scotia, where we have pursued, we have dug deep in the mines of silver bullets only to find that there weren't any. And we have to be very, very careful as we pursue these themes. Now, Tom Jenkins advised us in what I thought was a very important observation, especially coming from somebody who comes out of the technology sector, that innovation is an economic process, not a technological process. Technology is merely a means to an end. And I think there's a common assumption in many conversations of the sort that we've had that if only we can get the right technology, or if only we can somehow market the right technology or utilize the right technology, that everything else falls into place. Everything falls into place in this conversation if and only if the market wants to see it fall into place. We need to appreciate that this whole conversation is driven fundamentally by the demands of the marketplace. Only if we are responsive to those demands, only if we develop our capacity to be more effective in response to those demands, will we be successful. It is important, as one of my colleagues suggested to me earlier, that we not just focus on getting better and better and better at doing the wrong things. We have, sadly, in Nova Scotia, think here Nova Scotia steel industry over a century, a long history of doing something better and better and better, but it was the wrong thing to be doing, and we wasted vast amounts of resources to a very poor outcome, sadly. So how do we characterize our economic setting? As Ray Ivany reminded us earlier today, we are a small corner of a global economy. We cannot succeed, and we heard this again even in the last session around agriculture, we cannot succeed simply by producing for ourselves. We are too small a market in almost every economic activity. Moreover, we cannot hide from the global economy. There's no way to sort of stand aside and say, we're going to avoid this. Eventually, even in the smallest sort of hidden corners of the world, the equivalent of Walmart shows up at your doorstep, and whether you like it or not, you're going to have to compete. And if you can't compete effectively, you're going to go out of business. And so, to me, that is just a profound reality. But if Walmart's coming in, as a sort of kind of metaphorical expression of the global economy, we can at the same time go out. We can reach out, and we need to reach out in every aspect of our business and public activities. We need to be continuously focused on that global economy. We use that language a lot. I think nobody needs any reminder of what the global economy is. But too often, I think when we talk about what we talk about what we have to sell, what our assets are, as opposed to what the market, what the world wants to buy. And I think that's really an important intellectual problem, and sometimes it becomes a public policy problem. As Tom Jenkins reminded us, the most important source of ideas for innovation come from our customers. We need to listen to our customers, which is to say, another way of just saying the same thing, which is we need to be attentive to the marketplace. If we come from a producer-oriented, these are our assets, somehow if we just do it better, somebody will buy it. We will just have done what we have done in the past, which is make large investments in areas that are not in demand in the larger marketplace. All of this says to me that we have to have what the Brazilian ambassador described in his remarks to us yesterday as a deep-rooted, long-term strategy towards innovation. That is, I guess, the essential agenda of our conversation here over the last 2 days. And in doing that work and moving towards that objective, I think something that we all, again, have to remind ourselves of is that we need a sense of patience. The challenges and the opportunities that we're dealing with are very complex. They're long-lasting. They're not going to disappear in the short term. And so we have to have a sense of perspective on these things. I was struck in the session earlier today in the agriculture session where one of the speakers talked about the fact that investment in his particular activity took a long time to mature. I guess that's true in general of many agricultural products. It's true of many other sectors of the economy. Investments in innovation often take a long time to mature, and so one needs patience and perspective on this process. Again, there are no short-term fixes, there are no magic bullets. And in a small province with limited capacities, it seems to me that it's really crucial that we therefore all have a sense that we're pulling in the same direction. The notion of alignment, I think, is absolutely critical to us. And alignment of action is very, very important. Eric Grimson used the phrase, he reminded us of the phrase that he took some liberties with, that it takes a community to raise an entrepreneur. And that's, again, another way of saying ecosystem. We certainly have a busy community. There's your ecosystem map that all of you had in your workbooks, and some of my colleagues filled it out as best they could. They had the advantage over some of you because they had a little longer to do it. And as you can see, it's an incredibly busy illustration. My purpose in showing this is largely visual. It's not to sort of go through each and every one of these components. But I would like to sort of, again, remind you of the significance of alignment, and perhaps over time we can come back to this simplification. There are a lot of people doing a lot of very busy things. Let's hope we're all pulling in the same direction. And pulling in the same direction is tremendously important. And here I'd like to sort of just return back to the story that you all heard about MIT. And as Eric Grimson talked to us about the fantastic achievements and success of MIT, I was sitting in the audience listening to him, somewhat enviously, because of course they are sitting on massive resources in as he described it, a very rich ecosystem environment. So they're the gold star standard to which we're aspiring. But as I sat there listening to him sort of reel off all of the activities at his university, As president of a university that has an engineering program, I couldn't help but have this sort of list in my head going along. He says they're doing this, and I'm saying, do we have that? Yeah, we have that. Maybe a lesser version, but we have it. He says they're doing that, and I'm thinking, yeah, we sort of do that. And then all the way through. So at the end of the conversation and the description of courses and co-ops and entrepreneurial education and competitions and mentoring and so on, all of which was as he presented it, and I'm not taking away from his presentation at all. It was truly fantastic. It was very impressive, but then, and I kept saying, yeah, we have some version of this. Maybe it's a pale version, but we nonetheless have it. But what struck me was not they're doing something and we're not doing something. What really struck me about his conversation is that one, we obviously lack the dynamic ecosystem that surrounds MIT's Kendall Square. We all know that. That's why we're here. We're trying to create something like that. But more importantly, from my perspective as I listened, I also was struck by the fact that we lack a consolidating narrative. Remember, he told us a story. He told us, despite his comments about, I tell jokes and they're not funny and nobody listens, he was actually a very compelling speaker, and he was telling us a very compelling story. And his story was one in which, essentially, you have a whole institution that he says is dedicated to a common purpose. Everybody in the institution is dedicated to innovation and entrepreneurship. And everything they do falls under, fits into, supports, advances some aspect of that overriding goal, objective, idea. Now, I personally have no idea how true that is on the ground. I'm perfectly prepared to take it completely at face value, and objectively there's lots of evidence to support that. But what I came away from listening to his story was not that we don't do some of the activities that they do, but I really came away struck by the fact that we do not have a similar compelling meta-narrative, a compelling, unique, integrating story. There is certainly, that doesn't exist at my university. It doesn't exist in my own faculty of engineering, and I don't say that in any fault-finding way, because I want to make a larger point about that. And it certainly doesn't exist in our province in terms of the sort of the economic development thrust. And it does seem to me that if we are going to ultimately to achieve alignment, if we're going to sift all of that kind of mess that's up there on the screen so that we're certain that we're all pulling in the same direction, pushing towards the same goals, we will definitely have to evolve a narrative about who we are, what we're about, what our goals are, how we're all contributing, how we're all part of this larger picture. When you've got that culture of innovation, when you've got an opportunity as a byproduct of that culture of innovation to celebrate a culture of success, the comment that he made over and over again, which is, gee, that guy did really well. I'm sure I could do just as well as he did. When you've got that, it seems to me you've hit the mother lode. At that point, obviously there are a whole host of other challenges, execution issues, but you are in a very rich spot. And it does strike me that we in Nova Scotia lack that. I've heard this described in many ways, many versions of this. I'll share one story from my own experience. A number of years ago, more than a decade ago, we had a plan that we wanted to expand our pharmacy program at Dalhousie. And to do so, we recognized that we had to increase lab space in the building that housed the program. And so we set about a small fundraising campaign, essentially to raise $1 million so that we could renovate some of the rooms in the building and add to the lab space that we had there. The day arrived, all the work was done. We were about to have a little ribbon cutting ceremony, and we brought all the donors to the event, and we brought various representatives of the pharmacy sector to the event, and we had a very nice party, and we all were quite happy about it. And along the way, we said, in passing, that this was a great effort. Everybody is to be thanked. We've raised $940,000 towards our $1 million goal, and we're sure we'll finish off this effort in no time flat. The next day, I opened the local newspaper to read that, and the headline of the story that described this was, "Dal falls $60,000 short of goal." Now, to me, this was a kind of wake-up call to the character of the culture that we're dealing with. If that's how you sort of see the other side of the coin of success, fine. Dal falls $60,000 short. Now, there was, I will say, in concluding, because this is another part of our culture that is well worth celebrating, about an hour after I got to the office that morning, I got a call from somebody that I knew in the community, and he opened the conversation very quickly by saying, "I hear you have a problem." I often have problems, but I wasn't sure which one he was referring to. And so, sort of discreetly dancing around till I could figure out what he was talking about, it emerged that he'd read the story. And he said, "Oh, I see you're a little short on your campaign." I said, "Yeah, but I'm sure we're going to, get it together very quickly." He said, "Well, look, I'd like to help out. I'd like to do it anonymously. So I'm going to just send you a check for $60,000. So happy end to the story, but I mean, what a pathetic way to sort of proceed towards a celebration of success, a celebration of innovation, a step forward in terms of developing a very important component of our healthcare system, a component of our sort of retail economy, by saying essentially Dal falls $60,000 short. So for me, this notion of listening to Eric Grimson talk about the success of MIT and the culture that they've built around that success so that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and it attracts winners. The students who are attracted are winners who want to be there. The faculty are of the same ilk. The venture capitalists and the lawyers and the various folks who congregate around the university are of the same character, and none of them are thinking about falling short. They are all thinking about, sure, I could have a few missteps along the way, some slippage here and there, but at the end of the day, I'm confident that we're going to make it. Whether they do or not is a second-level story, but that fundamental confidence is something that I think we need to cultivate very profoundly in our province if we're going to have a culture of innovation, because it's only with that confidence in ourselves, our confidence in our future, that we will be able to succeed. There were many sort of features of the standard economic development story that were sort of put out before you by the different speakers, each giving their own sort of emphasis, their own sort of sector or personal perspective on it. Let me just say a few words about a number of these components. I'm probably mostly going to repeat points that were made, but I think they deserve to be underlined, and in some cases I'd like to sort of advance a few pet projects of my own, but I will try to sort of do it in the context of our larger discussion. There was a lot of emphasis, quite rightly, on human capital. To succeed in an innovation economy, you need smart people, you need educated people, you need people who are trained to meet the needs of the economic activities of the province. A number of you were polled yesterday about what you thought were important sort of parameters of success. You gave us some very useful feedback, which we're going to process as we think about the character of this conversation. Two of the things that you said, in fact, three of the things that you said, which I think all bear on this question of human capital, which need to be emphasized here, was the importance of graduate students, and you got a sense of that from, again, from the MIT story. He drew, I think, an interesting distinction between students who studied IT-related activities, which have very low sort of barriers to entry from a capital perspective, at least in terms of developing the initial prototype, as compared to lab bench, high technology sorts of activities that require much longer periods of study. So undergraduates were often successful in the IT side, but it was graduate students who were driving the sort of the materials sector, the healthcare innovations, the biotech innovations. All of those required large investments and large concentrations of talented people working on vital problems. So graduate students are really important in our community, and in terms of the way forward, I think I'll go right past this slide, come back to it later. In terms of the way forward, it's important to note that we do not have, as a province, support for graduate students. Many provinces in Canada have make significant investments in graduate student population to attract the best students, to retain the best students at their graduate programs. And we know historically that graduate students who study at our universities tend to stay in the province after they graduate in a higher proportion than undergraduate students. So this is an investment not only in the sort of skills of the graduate students who are trained in our labs and in our graduate programs, but it's an investment, I think, in the long-term sort of human capital that's available. So that's something that I think deserves some greater attention going forward. The second point that you made, which I think is, again, well appreciated in the larger community, is that too often companies, local companies, prove unwilling, unable to absorb students who graduate from our universities, and particularly graduate students, either because of some anxiety about wage levels or about where they would fit into the larger system. And I think it's important, again, as part of the components of the ecosystem that we're talking about developing, that we really turn our minds to this. We saw the data that Ray Ivany presented, this overwhelming demographic story about the real suppression of the labor market looking out ahead. We are going to be in a situation where the notion of requiring 3 to 5 years experience, and then maybe I'll talk to you, is going to be just a ridiculous assumption. You're going to be sort of standing in line sort of as the students are walking through the cafeteria a month before graduation, you know, begging them to come and work for your company. And so it's important that we develop a deeper understanding of that in the business community on the one hand, but we also recognize that there are serious issues that they have to deal with in terms of their ability to hire. And so I think we need to look at some public policy questions around incenting behavior. And there are a variety of initiatives. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them could be related to tax policy. Some of them could be related to direct grants. There are a number of issues, but what's crucial is that if we're investing resources in training a talented population, we need to keep them close to home by hiring them. And the third point that was made, and I think it's a really, again, a profound one, relates again to human capital, and that's the importance of immigration. Innovation obviously involves the notion of risk-taking. What greater group what group in the population takes a greater risk than immigrants? They leave their homes, they leave their familiar culture, their surroundings, their families, and they move somewhere else, sometimes where the language is different, where certainly the work culture is different. I mean, they are certainly risk takers of the highest level. And our inability, historically, to attract and retain large numbers of immigrants is a vital problem for us. Again, I know that people are working on this problem, but I think these things link back in terms of hiring, in terms of being open and welcoming, and making sure that we recognize credentials. There's a whole host of issues here that need to be attended to, and unless we can get these components of the ecosystem right, we are going to have long-term issues here. All of them, however, I believe, are issues that we can positively address. Another sort of component of the discussion turned on essentially the character of the market. We know that we have small firms. We know that it's difficult for them often to think about exporting. There's huge risks associated with that activity, a lot of risk and capital that has to be deployed for firms that are often small and lacking those kinds of resources to seek out market opportunities. So a number of thoughts on this point. One, there are real advantages for firms in that situation, in those circumstances, to collaborate. It's very important, I think, that we develop a much more collaborative culture around seeking markets. At the end of the day, of course, people will compete with one another for success in whatever foreign marketplaces are discovered and developed. But getting there is a very difficult process. So we have some initiatives already in place. We know the provincial government, the federal government frequently lead trade missions to here, there, and everywhere. Very good, very important. I'm always struck by the fact that when I read about these things, and I've gone on a couple myself, there are relatively small numbers of people who attend. So that's a problem. We need to sort of increase a greater awareness of the significance of this. I think we also have to, again, look at policy measures to help small firms manage the risk involved of when they have scarce resources and they're looking at a risky venture of going abroad. How can we help share the risk involved? How can we minimize it? Again, different ways of thinking about it. We could use tax policy around to create some kinds of incentives. It takes a while to develop profitable sales in foreign markets, and then once you do, of course, some of the profits are being taxed away. Maybe there should be thresholds for foreign sales in comparison to local sales. This is just an idea that needs to be explored. Maybe there are other public policy measures in terms of sharing risk, again, in terms of grants and the like. But somehow or other, we need to help share and minimize the risks, whether it's in terms of policies that create incentives or those that offset various fully defined risks. The most important policy that emerged in this conversation, and I think it's frankly going to be a challenging one, but I think it's profoundly important, and that's this issue of government as a customer. In a small economy, the government is often one of the largest customers in the marketplace. And for some firms in different sectors, gaining access to that level of business gives them a sufficient leg up, potentially, to then be in a position to begin to think about broader markets and to think about leveraging the success they've enjoyed locally by looking for a similar business elsewhere. And so procurement policies by government are really, really important. That's been driven home to us recently by obviously the potential of the shipbuilding contract. There have been some national studies around defense procurement, but this is an area I think that it needs a lot of study. It's a complex business. It's perfectly understandable why governments which are focused on, optimizing taxpayers' dollars would go for the lowest priced supplier. It's perfectly understandable that's also the simplest metric. You just get them all in front of you as long as they've met the basic tests of what you're looking for is lowest price. Why would you shop elsewhere? Well, there are some other reasons why you would shop elsewhere in terms of developing your local economy, in terms of thinking about various options that are aligned with other policies that you're pursuing. And this is a matter, I think, that came up over and over again in the conference and that needs further analysis and ultimately action. I don't want to suggest for a second that this is a simple matter. It isn't. I'm aware just even through the university where we have over 2,000 suppliers at Dalhousie from the local economy selling us roughly $120 million a year worth of goods. Frankly, we take the same approach. We just look for the cheapest supplier. But that just speaks to the fact that we're not aligned with larger development objectives. The government is not aligned with all their other objectives, and I think all of us need to especially big organizations, need to turn our attention to this so that we can facilitate a multi-pronged pulling in the same direction alignment that we hope to see. Another point that was really important and I think deserves a lot of attention, certainly inside the universities, but probably in some aspects of public policy as well. Goes back to the observation that Tom Jenkins made about strategies of invention versus strategies of innovation. And I think I can say with some confidence, and my academic colleagues in the university can I think, attest to this, that overwhelmingly R&D policy in Canada has been focused on a strategy of invention. The whole conversation around commercializing university research turns on that notion. Give somebody a grant, let them go off and study whatever subject. They're going to come up with eventually some product which will end up on the grocery store closest to your home. And that will be a test of success. I have no problem with that. If that's how things work out, that's perfectly reasonable. But the economy of Canada, and certainly the economy of Nova Scotia, is not going to sort of move forward with the episodic small number of successes along those lines. Far more important is the innovation that occurs inside companies by employees of those companies, sometimes with the support of R&D efforts at the university. So I would, for example, champion and ask, frankly, in terms of public policy, this seems to me to be an important initiative that should be reinforced over and over again, the significance of IRAP support for small companies to access R&D activities either in the community college or in the university, the voucher program that the province created, I think with great success for small companies to access universities. These are projects that turn on somebody, again, market-driven. We in our company have a problem, we'll take it to the university and see if somebody there can help us sort it out. It's often a tweaking issue, it's a small-scale issue, it's not as grand as inventing some great new product that derives directly from the research activity of the researcher, but it, I think, often has a much larger impact on corporate development than some of these other grander efforts. So we can celebrate the spin-offs from universities. Certainly it's part of my job to stand up and celebrate those occasional episodes. But from my own personal experience, serving on a number of local company boards, I can tell you directly that the innovative activity inside the company, sometimes with university backing, is way, way more important. And so there needs to be a greater sense of connection, I think, between university activities on the one hand and that innovation agenda, innovation economy on the other. And again, thinking back to the MIT story, I'm using that as a bit of a touchstone for my comments here. I think he used the phrase that he invented, which is a nice one actually, intrapreneurship. He wanted to give their students an opportunity to learn about innovation inside established companies. That, I think, is something very important. We actually have vehicles towards that at many of our universities. At Dalhousie, about a third of our undergraduates are involved in co-op programs of one sort or another. But frankly, we don't focus on that aspect of their work. We're looking for other qualities to the experience that they gain. And I think thinking about this conversation around entrepreneurship, it certainly left me with some ideas about ways in which we need to fine-tune some of the expectations that we impose on our programs. Similarly, again looking at innovation inside the firm, let me suggest that we think about this across a wide range of sort of initiatives. So governments in Nova Scotia and in all other political jurisdictions quite commonly make grants of funds to companies to help support their future success. No problem in that from my perspective. Typically, the metric used to define success is jobs. We will give you so much money and you promise to create so many jobs. Again, nothing wrong with that, perfectly sensible. But when you think about some of the companies that we've supported over the years, how often have we imposed or suggested, required, however you want to sort of define it, metrics that focus on other elements, whether it's R&D activity, support by the company in the local environment, whether it's innovation initiatives that have certain metrics attached to them. These are things that should be part of our expectations attached to grants just as much as we look to you to create X job and Y job and so on. These are things that I think, if properly aligned with sort of a longer term, deeper strategy, would again serve our province well. And it's something that I think, again, we can work on. The final point I guess I want to make, and I'll go back to my slide for just a second, if I haven't totally messed up here. So, lots of activity here, lots of people engaged, lots of energy. I actually fit into 3 or 4 of those circles, so I'm not about to say one nasty thing about any of those circles. But the point I want to make is to pursue all of the agendas that we have talked about in the last day and a half. There are going to be all sorts of resource calls. It's fine to say everybody should work smarter. You don't have to work harder, you just have to work smarter. Yeah, okay, it's easy. That's why, sometimes being the head of an organization is a lot easier than being the guy who's working on the shop floor, because I can prattle on, but that person actually has to translate this verbiage into actual work. And sometimes it's expensive for organizations to work smarter, and it's certainly at the university it's expensive to do the kinds of things that we do. And frequently we're aware of the fact, and I don't say this in any immediately challenging way, that fiscal crisis, governments have limited resources, there are many calls on their time and energy, and so you have to take your place in line. All of which is fine so far as it goes, but let me take you back to the presentation again by Tom Jenkins, where he had a cartoon on the in his slide, and if I'd been better organized, I would have brought the cartoon with me, but it was a bunch of guys sitting around a board table talking about the various things that they had to do for their company to succeed, and on the table was a giant elephant, which was labeled competition, and he talked about the elephant in the room that nobody talks about. And I think there's an elephant in the room here that nobody talks about when we have these conversations about economic development and innovation, and that's called the healthcare system. The healthcare system in this province and in every other province in Canada and in many other countries, so again, this is no great singular public policy failure on the part of this group of political leaders or that group of political leaders. It's obviously a systemic problem. But for all the conversation that we have about the lack of resources to do all the important things that we know need to be done, and recognize that there are limited resources, the machine of the healthcare system just keeps gobbling up resources and more resources and more resources, and shockingly, the resources are always available. Perhaps not as much as those inside that part of the system want, but they are available in unbelievable amounts of money. And just let me make a point here, just by way of comparison. And my point isn't to attack the healthcare system. Obviously, my university is an active player in creating the workforce for the healthcare system and doing a lot of R&D in relation to those activities. But I do want to make a larger point around it. 20 years ago, the universities received $218 million from the province in terms of government grants. The healthcare system at that time received about $1.25 billion, okay, about roughly six times the amount. 10 years ago, the university grant had actually gone down from $218 to $206 million. The healthcare budget had gone up to almost $2 billion, so an increase of about $750 million. At a time, I know I lived through this, there's not enough money in the system to support the universities. Really sorry, you're important, but we just don't have the funds. Except we do have $750 million for the guys across the street from the university. Fast forward to 10 years later, university grants have gone up, and I'm not making a case here for the university, I'm just trying to do it as a comparison point. The university grants had gone up by about 40%, so we're now up to about $330 million. But healthcare, in this period of tighten your belts, had gone up to almost $4 billion. So in a decade when we had no money, I'm sorry we can't build roads, I'm sorry we can't give you an economic development grant, sorry we don't have enough money to fund graduate students, sorry we don't have enough money to fund R&D. Well, we do have $2 billion additional funds to fund the healthcare system. My point here is simply to say there is a lot of money in the system. Just like my slides suggested, there is a lot of busy activity. It is not a resource question, it's a priority question. The challenges, of course, of reining in the costs of the healthcare system are monumental, and happily I have no responsibility whatsoever for doing this, so I can chatter from the sidelines and make cheap comments. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that the force of these comments needs to be taken seriously. If we're ever going to get ahead on the economic development front, we're going to have to invest. We're going to have to invest in people, we're going to have to invest in R&D, we're going to have to invest in infrastructure, we're going to have to invest in corporate initiatives, we're going to have to invest in a lot of things that we've talked about over this period, all of which are really important. And there's not going to be enough money to provide those investments unless we can wrap our arms around that big elephant in the room. We have gone from, as I said, 20 years ago, from a total expenditure in this province of $4.2 billion, very tough times over 20 years, to now spending $9.5 billion, over $5 billion more, and there's still no money. What happened to the $5 billion? That's, I think, one of the important questions that we need to sort of think about when we talk about innovation and the innovation economy. And of course, one of the sectors that needs to sort of innovate is the healthcare system, none of which we talked about here, but that's obviously a source where a lot of attention needs to be paid. So I hope you sort of take my comments on the healthcare system in the right spirit, which is simply to say it's about priorities, it's about alternatives, it's about choices and options. And frankly, if we're going to move forward on the innovation agenda, we're going to have to free up resources because there are limits. I accept that. There are limits. But it's a question of what we're doing with the resources that we have available. And this is not just about governments. This is not about governments making bad choices, because who's telling government to make those choices? Every single one of us in this room. We're all saying, spend more on my kid, spend more on my grandmother, spend more on my spouse, all of whom have needs and so on. There's a limit, and so this is a broad discussion, and in a way I think these two conversations about the innovation economy and the healthcare economy have to proceed in tandem on the one hand, and then I hope at some point the innovation economy conversation will turn towards the healthcare economy and start generating some resource savings that can be diverted to other more productive activities, because at the end of the day we're talking about activities that generate wealth, and we're talking about, on the other hand, activities that consume wealth. And we need to have more investment in the things that generate wealth and perhaps better manage those things that consume it. That brings me to the end of my remarks. As I said, this was a very rich conversation. I know I didn't do more than skim the surface of the many, many very, very insightful observations, but I hope I at least put some framework around them. And I invite all of you to stick with us, not only at this occasion, but stick with us as this conversation about innovation unfolds. There are a lot of people who put in a lot of hard work in pulling this event together. I know they have a long-term commitment to this topic. They're eager to see this conversation continue, and ultimately, I hope, as I'm sure you do, that this will move us in the right direction towards the wealth and prosperity and innovation that all of us so deeply desire. So thank you very much.